August 21st, 1972, Rome. The Colosseum, exterior staging area, just before 5 in the morning. Chuck Norris was already there when Bruce Lee arrived. This is the detail that stayed with me longest when I first started pulling at this story. Not the fight itself, which we will get to, but this, that on the morning they were scheduled to film the most significant martial arts confrontation that had ever been put on camera up to that point in cinema history, Chuck Norris was already on location before Bruce Lee, standing in the pre-dawn dark near the stone archways of the Colosseum's outer rim, in the specific dry heat of a Roman August that comes off the ancient stone like breath. No crew yet, no cameras, just a man who had been a 6-time world karate champion standing alone in the dark, working something through. I've thought about what that means. I keep coming back to it, and I'm not entirely sure I've landed on the right interpretation, but I'll tell you what I think. And then I'll tell you the part of this story that changed what I thought. The Way of the Dragon shoot was running through August and into September of 1972. Bruce Lee had written it, was directing it, and was its central performer, the first time he had occupied all 3 of those roles simultaneously on a single production. Golden Harvest had given him the creative control that the Hong Kong film industry had opened space for since breaking from the Shaw Brothers structure, and he had used that control to do something that no Hong Kong production had done before: take his crew to Rome, film in actual locations, and build the climax of the film around a fight between himself and the best-known Western martial artist he could find. Chuck Norris was 32 years old in August of 1972. He had retired from competitive karate in 1968 after winning the professional middleweight karate championship of the world, and had spent the years since building a reputation as an instructor. His students included Steve McQueen and Priscilla Presley, which in the specific social geography of 1970s Hollywood meant something real. He was not a film actor. He had done one small role, one minor appearance, nothing that amounted to a career. What he was, unambiguously, was a fighter. And in the martial arts world of 1972, before any unified competition structure existed, before styles were regularly tested against each other, when a man's reputation was built on a combination of tournament results and the specific word of mouth that moved through training schools and gyms, Chuck Norris's reputation was serious. Bruce Lee had wanted him specifically, not because they were friends, though they were. They had met in the late 1960s in Los Angeles, moved in overlapping circles, trained together on occasions that multiple accounts confirm. He wanted Chuck Norris because he understood something about what the fight scene needed to be, and that understanding required a specific kind of opponent. Not someone who could be visually dressed up as dangerous, someone who actually was. The first conversation about the role, by the accounts I found, was brief. Bruce Lee explained what the film needed. Chuck Norris listened. He had one question: how does it end? Bruce Lee told him. Norris said he needed to think about it. And this is the part of the story that every version agrees on, but that nobody I found has examined carefully enough. He came back and said yes, that is the documented sequence. The question, how does it end? And then yes. What happened in between those 2 moments is what this story is actually about. The Way of the Dragon shoot in Rome was operating with a Hong Kong crew in an Italian city in the middle of summer, and the specific texture of that is worth spending a moment with before we get to what happened between the 2 men. The Colosseum area in August 1972, in the early morning hours before the tourist flow started, was a different place from what it becomes by 9 o'clock. The stone, pale gold in the right light, almost white before the sun got high, held the night's coolness until around 6:30, and then the heat came off it in a way that was dry and specific to Rome, completely unlike the wet weight of Hong Kong summer. The Hong Kong crew had brought their equipment on a production budget that was generous by Golden Harvest standards and modest by any international standard, and they had developed, over the weeks of the shoot, the particular resourcefulness of people making something work in conditions that were not built for them. Italian and Cantonese mixed on set constantly, with English as the bridge language between the two, sometimes switching mid-instruction when the vocabulary ran out. Bruce Lee directed in Cantonese and English simultaneously, often finishing a sentence in one language he had started in the other. The crew had adapted to this. His instructions were precise, not the general directorial language of mood or intention, but specific physical instructions with specific spatial measurements. This camera angle, this distance, this is where the movement ends and the camera must already be there. The production had been running for 3 weeks by the time they got to the Colosseum sequence. Bruce Lee had not slept more than 5 hours on any night of the shoot. This is not an inference. Multiple crew members noted it in the accounts I found, with the specific quality of observation that comes from people who were watching him closely because what he was doing was worth watching closely. He was 31 years old, 5 feet 7 inches, 135 pounds, and he was carrying the entire architecture of this production in his head simultaneously, every shot, every decision, every element of the thing he was building. The Colosseum sequence was the last major shoot. Everything had been building toward it, and Chuck Norris had a problem with how it ended. Actually, let me go back, that's not quite the right way to say it. Because a problem suggests conflict, and what every account I found describes is something more complicated and more interesting than conflict. What Chuck Norris had was a condition, not stated as a demand. Stated, according to the people who were present when he and Bruce Lee spoke about it directly, as a question about something that mattered to him. Which is different. The fight, as Bruce Lee had written it, ended with Chuck Norris's character dead, not defeated, not knocked out and left breathing. Dead, Bruce Lee's character covering the body respectfully, honoring a man he had beaten. This was deliberate. Bruce Lee had written it this way specifically because he wanted the fight to carry a particular weight, that the man who loses was genuinely dangerous, that winning over him cost something, that the victory was not clean in the way victories in martial arts films were usually clean. He wanted the audience to feel, at the end, something adjacent to grief. Not for the villain, Norris's character was the antagonist, but for what it means to be that good at something and still lose. Chuck Norris understood all of this. He was not a naive person about storytelling, even if he was new to film. What he said in the conversation that the accounts describe was not, "I won't lose." What he said was something closer to, "I need to know that losing, in this specific way, means what you say it means, that the way it's shot will show what I actually am, not a stepping stone, not a dummy for the hero to beat. The real thing, and if you can show me that, if you can show me, in the way you film it, that the man I'm playing was genuinely as dangerous as I can make him, then I'll give you everything." This is the moment in the story that I want to sit with for a minute. Because when I first came across accounts of this conversation, my reading of it was straightforward, a proud martial artist negotiating the terms of his screen defeat, protecting his ego, understandable, human, not particularly complex. I held that reading for a while, and then I looked more carefully at what Bruce Lee actually agreed to, and what the agreement changed about the sequence, and I had to revise my understanding of what the conversation had actually been about. Bruce Lee's condition was this: yes, just that. He said yes. He told Chuck Norris that what he was asking for was exactly what he had already written, that the film had always intended to show Norris's character as the genuine article, that the respect in the ending was not decoration, it was the point. He said something in that conversation, and this is documented in at least 2 separate accounts from people who were present or who heard it shortly after, that I want to be careful about paraphrasing because the specific shape of it matters. He said that the man who fears losing has already put a limit on what he is willing to become, that there was no loss in this fight that diminished what Norris was. The loss was in the film. What Norris actually was would be visible in every frame. The accounts of what Norris said in response don't agree on the exact words. What they agree on is that he didn't say much. He looked at Bruce Lee for a moment. Then he nodded. They began rehearsing the sequence the following morning. Here is where I need to be straight with you about the limits of what I actually know. The accounts of the rehearsal period, 3 days, possibly 4, in the Colosseum area before they began filming are consistent in the broad strokes and inconsistent in the details in ways that I find genuinely hard to resolve. Multiple sources describe a quality in the rehearsals that was different from normal film choreography, more mutual. Both men apparently spent significant portions of the rehearsal not executing the planned choreography, but doing something closer to genuine sparring, controlled, at partial speed, but real enough that crew members watching described a quality of attention in the space that they had not seen on any other day of the shoot. The specific number of crew present varies, somewhere between 30 and 50 people working in the general area, not all of them watching directly, but all of them aware that something was happening. What I cannot verify, and will not pretend to verify, is whether the rehearsals changed the choreography in any significant way. Some accounts suggest Bruce Lee altered specific sequences after the rehearsals, that what Norris showed him during the exploratory sparring prompted additions or adjustments to the planned fight. Other accounts describe the film sequence as substantially identical to the original plan. I spent a long time trying to find something concrete to anchor this to, and I could not. I'm telling you this because it matters for understanding what happened when they actually filmed it. The filming took 2 days. The production logs, the actual documented record, confirm the days and the general sequence of shots. What they don't record, because production logs don't record this kind of thing, is the specific quality of what was captured. The fight sequence in Way of the Dragon is 11 minutes long in the final film. It is the longest martial arts fight sequence that had been filmed up to that point. Bruce Lee shot it with a care for spatial geography that is visible if you know to look for it. The camera always shows you where both men are, what the distance between them is, what options each of them has in any given moment. This was deliberate. Most martial arts film choreography of this era used camera proximity and editing speed to create the impression of danger. Bruce Lee used actual distance and actual speed and let the camera stay wide enough that the viewer could see what was actually happening. And what was actually happening in the filmed sequence was Chuck Norris fighting at a level that required Bruce Lee to be exactly what he was in order to beat him. This is the thing I want you to look at if you go back and watch that sequence. Not Bruce Lee. Watch Chuck Norris. Watch the specific quality of what he does in the first 3 minutes of the fight before the momentum shifts. There is a period, roughly the first third of the sequence, where Bruce Lee's character is in real difficulty. Not performed difficulty, genuine tactical difficulty, the kind that requires adjustment and problem solving in real time. And the reason it reads as genuine is because Chuck Norris is actually doing something that requires genuine response. The condition had been met. Norris was the real thing on screen, unmistakably. This is where I want to ask you something directly, because I've been thinking about this since I first understood what the negotiation between these two men had actually produced. There are 2 ways to read what Chuck Norris did by agreeing to lose in this specific way, to bring this specific quality to a defeat that would be seen by everyone who watched the film. The first reading is that he was protecting himself, that the condition he set ensured his reputation would survive what his character didn't. The second reading is something more interesting and harder to name, that he understood what Bruce Lee was actually asking, which was not for a performance of danger, but for the real thing, and that he was willing to put the real thing on screen and lose with it anyway, because the alternative, going through the motions, protecting himself through controlled performance, would have been a smaller thing entirely. Which of those readings do you think is true? I mean that genuinely. I'd like to know which one lands for you. Leave it in the comments. I read them, and this particular question I have not been able to settle on my own. What happened on the second day of filming is the part of the story I think matters most, and the part that has received the least attention in every account I've found. The sequence required multiple setups. The camera positions changed throughout the day as the geography of the fight moved across the space. Later in the afternoon of the second day, the production logs give the time as approximately 4:15, though the accounts suggest it may have been later. They were filming the final sequence, the ending. The part that Norris had asked about, and that Bruce Lee had given his condition about. Norris's character is on the ground, injured, unable to continue. Bruce Lee's character stands over him and does not deliver the finishing blow. He waits. He gives the man on the ground time to yield. This is the scene as written. Norris's character refuses to yield, and only then, only after the refusal, does the fight end as it ends. The scene required Norris to stay on the ground while Bruce Lee stood over him. For the camera. For the film. Publicly. He did it. Fully. Without performance of reluctance. Without anything in his physicality that suggested resistance to the scene. He played it as it was written, which meant playing a man who had given everything he had and still lost, and meeting that loss with a kind of dignity that the film required him to find. This is what Bruce Lee had told him was in the script. And it was there, after the final take of that sequence, and the accounts agree on this detail specifically, which is why I trust it. Bruce Lee did something that nobody had been expecting. He stopped the crew from moving to the next setup. He walked to where Norris was still on the ground and extended his hand and pulled him up. Not for the camera. The cameras were being repositioned. He pulled him up and said something, quietly, that none of the accounts I found were close enough to hear. Norris nodded. That was the exchange. I spent a long time trying to find out what was said. I did not find it. What I found instead, looking at the finished film and at the accounts of the people who were present, was something I had not been expecting when I started this research. The thing I had been treating as a story about negotiation, about a proud man working out the terms of a screen defeat, was not quite that. Or it was that, but it was also something else underneath it. Bruce Lee had written a villain who could not be beaten without cost, who had to be shown as genuinely dangerous, genuinely formidable, in order for the film's ending to mean what he needed it to mean. He had needed Chuck Norris to bring the real thing to that role, and he had understood from the beginning that asking someone to do that, to be genuinely as good as they are and lose anyway, publicly, on camera, was asking for something that cost something real. The condition Chuck Norris had set was not about ego, or not only about ego. It was about whether the man asking him understood what he was asking for, and the condition Bruce Lee agreed to, the simple yes, the explanation of what the film had always intended, was not a negotiation, it was recognition. He was telling Norris that he already knew what he was asking, and that he was asking it because nothing less would serve what the film needed to be. The Kung Fu television series had premiered in America the same month The Way of the Dragon shoot was running in Rome, August 1972. David Carradine, a white actor, playing a Chinese-American martial artist in a role that multiple documented accounts from people who knew Bruce Lee confirm he had been involved in developing, and from which he had been excluded by a network that believed an Asian man could not carry an American television series. Bruce Lee knew about this. He was in Rome building something with his own hands, in response to a system that had decided he didn't belong in it. What he was building in Rome, and specifically in those 2 days at the Colosseum, required Chuck Norris to lose, not because losing was the point, because what Bruce Lee was making was a proof that a Chinese man on screen, in a film he had written and directed and was performing in, could face the best the Western martial arts world had and win. Not through cinematic trickery, visibly, the camera wide enough that you could see what was actually happening. He needed Norris to be the real thing in order for the proof to mean anything, and Norris had understood that. The question, how does it end, was not resistance. It was the question of a man who needed to know that what he was being asked to participate in was genuine before he decided whether to give it what it required. He had decided yes. What I find myself left with, after a long time with this story, is not the fight sequence, though the fight sequence is extraordinary. It is that pre-dawn image I started with, Chuck Norris, alone at the Colosseum, before the crew arrived, before Bruce Lee arrived, working something through in the dark, in the dry August heat coming off 2,000-year-old stone. He had already made his decision by then. The yes had been given. What he was doing in the dark, by himself, was preparing to honor it as fully as he was capable of. The film was released on December 30th, 1972. It was Bruce Lee's first film as writer and director. He died 7 months later, on July 20th, 1973, at 32 years old, before he could see what the proof he had built in Rome eventually proved. Chuck Norris went on to a film career that made him one of the most recognizable action performers of his generation. He never had a better scene than the one he lost.